Want to know how to feint to attention? Just feel like watching some people fall over? Make like a royal guard and don't go anywhere, because we've got it all. Plenty of jobs have strict rules and regulations, particularly those in the military, but there are a few positions that require the composure, stamina, and decorum expected of the soldiers who serve as the Queen's Royal Guard during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. The Royal Bodyguard dates back to the era of King Henry VII. It's a position of honor and one of the oldest units within the British Army. Protocols that all Royal Guards must follow include avoiding smiling and laughing, remaining unreactive to people surrounding them, foregoing bathroom breaks, and even learning how to feint properly. So how does one feint properly while guarding the British sovereign? As it turns out, guards must learn how to feint to attention, which is why these poor soldiers usually end up lying face down on the ground with their arms at their sides. It's expected that if a soldier feels themselves going down, they should pitch forward directly onto their fronts while still holding their rifle at attention. As Major Di Bevan of the Welsh Guards told The Express, it will probably involve a broken nose and a whole lot of missing teeth. It happens all the time, too. One of the guards holding vigil at Queen Elizabeth II's coffin at the Palace of Westminster fainted in front of a large crowd of shocked onlookers, several of whom had spent hours in line waiting to pay their respects to the Queen. The live stream of the event paused momentarily as police officers went to assist. The other guards remained at attention, as is the protocol in such situations. Soldiers from the Sovereign's Bodyguard, the Household Division, and the Yeoman Warders of the Tower of London remain at the Queen's coffin for 24 hours each day as she lies in state. They remain entirely motionless at each corner of the casket's podium, rotating every 20 minutes but completing a total of 6 hours of standing for each shift. But how can guards avoid fainting in the first place? Garrison Sergeant Major Billy Mott told The Express that he recommends exercising in advance, staying hydrated, and wiggling one's toes and tensing the calves while standing. He explained, "If you are resting on your heels, the blood doesn't flow back to the brain."
If you hydrate, wiggle your toes, if you eat and scoff in the morning, then you're fine.
And Royal Guards have struggled to stay standing for decades. More recently, in 2016, no fewer than 2 guards fainted during the first 2 days of Queen Elizabeth's 90th birthday bash. The first casualty of uprightness fell to the ground outside of St. Paul's Cathedral, and the second dropped during the Trooping the Color Parade. The following year, in 2017, the Trooping the Color Parade once again saw not the toppling of 2 troops, but at least 5. A spokesperson at the time said, "We can confirm that during the Queen's birthday parade today, a small number of soldiers fainted. It is an extremely hot day, and all were removed from the parade and checked by medical staff where they were hydrated. It's not just the British royal retinue who are known for dropping during prolonged ceremonies either. During the christening of Sweden's Prince Julian in 2021, a guard fainted flat on his back before the ceremony even began. 3 years earlier, in 2018, a Swedish royal guard fainted during the christening of Princess Adrienne. Denmark saw one of its own proud soldiers smack the tiles during the gala for the Danish Queen Margrethe. He was promptly dragged away before guests started arriving. With all of these soldiers dropping left and right, it probably makes sense that there are strict protocols regarding how to fall forward and at attention. That way, the fallen soldier's comrades can better sidestep the body while an attendant darts in to drag away the evidence, before too many photos are snapped. Still, maybe the military could always take a step further and invest in some more lightweight uniforms, because who could really be expected to stay standing on a hot day with one of these on your head? No one understands the dangers of insufficient sleep better than members of the military. Back in World War II, the KGB and the Japanese military weaponized sleep deprivation, using it to torture POWs. In 1971, the British Army came under fire for allegedly depriving IRA members of sleep as an interrogation tactic, and the Pentagon has acknowledged employing sleep deprivation to break the will of uncooperative prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. Denying a tired person shut-eye for prolonged periods breaks their brain without breaking bones. It causes psychosis as soldiers slip into disoriented states and start conversing with figments of their addled minds. Lack of shut-eye also proved ruinous for pilots, who sometimes sleepily shot down their own allies or got shot down themselves because of exhaustion-induced errors. So the U.S. military devised a means of helping soldiers sleep between bouts of bedlam and bloodshed. According to Business Insider, Naval Ensign Bud Winter was enlisted to design and teach a sleep technique for soldiers. Winter, who had previously worked with a psychologist to boost the productivity of athletes, developed a sleep method that worked for 96% of soldiers after 6 weeks of training. Perhaps more impressively, it only took troops 2 minutes to transport themselves from a war zone to the land of Nod. And now we're going to teach it to you. The trick consists of 5 distinct steps. First, assume a comfortable position, like sitting in a soft office chair somewhere where no one will see you slacking off at work. Next, you let the muscles of your face sag. Don't hold them tight anymore. Third, you allow your shoulders, neck, and back to go totally limp. Go full ragdoll. The fourth step is to relax your legs. And then there's step 5, arguably the most important step. Once you're all droopy, saggy, and limp, empty your mind of all movement-related thoughts. Instead, imagine yourself in a hammock or a canoe, or simply tell yourself don't think, shutting out all other thoughts for a minimum of 10 seconds. Getting enough sleep isn't just vital for the military, it's important for everyone. According to the CDC, between 2005 and 2009, sleep deprivation caused an average of 83,000 automobile crashes, resulting in 886 deaths per year. And those numbers are believed to be conservative. It's possible that drowsy driving could be responsible for up to 6,000 fatal crashes a year. See, it turns out getting behind the wheel when you haven't had enough sleep is a lot like getting behind the wheel when you've had too much alcohol. Staying up for 18 hours approximates the effects of having a blood alcohol content of 0.05%. Once you hit 24 or more hours, it's like having a blood alcohol content of 0.1%, which is above the legal limit in every state in the country. Drowsy driving poses a danger for any motorist, but it's especially perilous for truckers who drive long hours and are often short on sleep. A 1997 study of 80 truckers found that they spent an average of 5.18 hours in bed per day, and only got 4.78 hours of electrophysiologically verified sleep daily over a 5-day period. A 6-month study of 260 North Carolina truckers conducted in 2015 found that 46.5% of them averaged less than 7 hours of sleep on workdays. Obviously, sleep deprivation and giant trucks are a recipe for disaster. In 2014, ABC reported on multiple deaths caused by exhausted truckers, including an incident in which a trucker who'd been awake for 36 hours killed a toll worker and injured a state trooper. That same year, comedian Tracy Morgan suffered serious injuries and his friend James Jimmy Mac McNair lost his life when a Walmart truck collided with their vehicle. According to Rolling Stone, the driver had been awake for over 28 hours. If anyone could benefit from the military sleep technique, it's probably the sleep-deprived truckers. So get some shut-eye and then keep on trucking. General Douglas MacArthur is one of the most notable and controversial military figures America has ever produced. He is remembered today for commanding armed forces in several key wars, rising to the highest rank in the land. But he's also remembered for being fired for insubordination, leading to decades of debate over his proper place in history. MacArthur was born on January 26, 1880 in Little Rock, Arkansas, one of 3 brothers. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., was in the Army and also a general. As a result, young Douglas grew up wherever his father was stationed, raised by both his parents in the ethos of the military lifestyle. MacArthur chose to follow in his father's footsteps. When the time came, he decided to enroll at West Point, graduating in 1903. He served in the Philippines before bouncing around to numerous posts, culminating in action along the Mexican border just prior to the outbreak of World War I. He climbed up the ranks in the Army, and by the end of the war, he was a brigadier general. He served as the superintendent of West Point, where he reformed the curriculum, and in 1930 he finally reached the top, becoming Chief of Staff of the Army. It didn't go well. MacArthur attracted widespread criticism in 1932 when he spearheaded an attack on a group of World War I veterans who were protesting to receive early payment of a delayed bonus for their service to the country. In a public relations and humanitarian disaster, MacArthur personally accompanied a wave of tanks and soldiers that drove out the veterans using tear gas and bayonets. 55 veterans were wounded in the attack, and a 12-year-old boy died. Though MacArthur had disregarded orders from President Hoover to halt the attack, it was Hoover who took the fall. MacArthur remained the Army Chief of Staff under new President Franklin Roosevelt before finally retiring in 1937. Yet General MacArthur returned in 1941. He led American armed forces in Southeast Asia to defend the Philippines against Japan. Though this army was defeated and captured, MacArthur himself escaped, famously vowing to return, a moment he made sure was caught on camera by the press. It made him an almost untouchable hero, and when the Korean War came along, MacArthur commanded the United Nations forces against North Korea. It would prove to be the end of his career. After North Korea invaded South Korea, MacArthur successfully counterattacked and pushed the North Koreans back to the border at the 38th parallel. President Harry Truman directed him to pause operations while a peace could be negotiated. However, MacArthur wanted to expand the war past Korea and into communist China. Ignoring the president's orders, he attacked, breaking the ceasefire and ending hopes for peace. In response, Truman relieved MacArthur and recalled him to the United States. MacArthur then made his famous speech before Congress, saying,
"That old soldiers never die. They just fade away."
MacArthur hoped to use this as the springboard to become president. Instead, high-ranking Republicans withdrew their support from MacArthur and backed his rival and former subordinate Dwight Eisenhower. Ultimately, Eisenhower would sign a peace treaty nearly identical to what Truman had hoped for, 2 years and millions of deaths later. This cloud still hung over MacArthur when his health began to fail a decade later. On March 2, 1964, General Douglas MacArthur was admitted to the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. He had sought care for abdominal pain and had to have his gallbladder removed, but the gallstones had already caused inflammation in his liver. A cascade of health issues followed. Following surgery for hemorrhaging in his esophagus, he had to have his spleen removed, and then his kidneys began to fail. He underwent a massive blood transfusion, but it wasn't enough. MacArthur fell into a coma when his liver and kidneys failed later that month. He died at 84 years old on April 5, 1964. MacArthur was survived by his wife Jean and his son Arthur, but his lasting legacy is a complex one. Some praise him as a hero who stood up to communist expansion, while others see him as an egotist who sacrificed his own men and risked the future of America itself for personal political gain. They say history will be the judge, but for MacArthur, the verdict is still out.
Area 51 is most commonly thought of as a place where the US military keeps UFOs and alien secrets, but no one outside the highest levels of government knows the truth. Though it may just be a fraction of the full story, here's what we know about Area 51.
It ain't on the map.
Trust me, it's there.
Okay, so when you're talking about Area 51, separating fact from fiction is a tricky matter. That said, this whole shebang reportedly got started during World War II. Somewhere between harnessing atomic energy and turning a skinny kid named Steve Rogers into a super soldier, the US military built a pair of small runways right next to Nevada's Groom Lake and named it the Army Air Corps Gunnery School. Sometime after the war, the gunnery school was abandoned. No biggie. Enter the paranoid 1950s, whereupon the equally paranoid CIA teamed up with the somehow even more paranoid Lockheed Aerospace Corporation. Their joint project, labeled Skunk Works, was intended to develop U-2 spy planes. The secrecy of the project meant that test flights had to be done in a remote location, far away from commercial and military flight paths, but close enough to a major city that receiving new supply shipments wouldn't be a total pain in the neck. Luckily, the project's Air Force liaison was around to mention the nice little abandoned gunnery school in Nevada where he had trained. After close inspections, Skunk Works moved in, set up shop, and started testing their spy planes. Obviously, they didn't tell any of this to the press. Their cover story was to refer to the military base as the Watertown Project, and claim that they were merely studying weird weather phenomena.
My, what's that?
Looks like rain.
These days, the existence of Area 51 is common knowledge. Nobody knows what they do there exactly, but everyone knows that it's a real place. Throughout the entirety of the 20th century, though, the US government refused to even admit that much. Seriously, the place was in movies and everything.
Nothing to see here, please!
It wasn't until 2013 that the CIA finally came clean about the test site's existence through declassifying some old documents about the subject. By this point, the X-Files theme was already embedded in people's brains, and decades of lying doesn't do a lot to inspire public trust. So, a lot of people weren't too inclined to buy the CIA's story about the base being used to test fly high-tech military weaponry, as opposed to, studying alien bodies from the Roswell incident or what have you.
This story isn't real.
Nonetheless, much of what the world knows today about Groom Lake's history is thanks to the 400 pages the CIA made public, and it does seem quite credible that the base's primary intention has indeed been to test experimental military aircraft. Could aliens have ever played a role in those experiments? You be the judge. If you're wondering how a sketchy government base could stay hidden for so long, you're not alone. But the cloud of secrecy surrounding Area 51 is foggy enough that even Agent K would get lost in it.
Sure you don't want some coffee?
The first thing you have to understand is that Area 51 isn't some dinky little hole in the desert. The base is stationed inside a 4,687 square mile piece of land that's way bigger than Rhode Island and almost the size of Connecticut. Secondly, they don't kid around when it comes to privacy. Any military pilots brave enough to fly into the airspace above Area 51 face a harsh trio of horrible consequences, starting with a court-martial, leading to a dishonorable discharge, and potentially culminating in time behind bars. The professional environment is reportedly so secretive that non-disclosure agreements are standard, and apparently, some people's jobs don't even officially exist. In an interview with a local Las Vegas news station, one former employee named T.D. Barnes claimed people on the base communicated with fake names and weren't even allowed to tell their families back home where they worked. Barnes said his own wife thought he did most of his secretive work in a foreign country until he told her the truth in 2009.
This is top secret mission, put a lid on it, make up a story, and go away.
Outside of a select few government workers and contractors, no one really knows what goes on at Area 51, and the people that do certainly aren't going to tell you about it.
You're on a need-to-know basis, and you don't need to know.
That said, you can be reasonably certain that the area is at least used for testing high-tech experimental military aircraft. The CIA's declassified documents make it clear that this was how the base was used throughout most of the 20th century. In addition to those U-2 spy planes, Lockheed's A-12 Archangels were also tested there in the 1960s, followed by stealth fighters in the 70s and Tacit Blue aircraft in the 80s. So presumably, the military is currently flying some ludicrously advanced new aircraft models out there today, the likes of which we won't see unveiled to the public for another few decades. It all makes perfect sense. Or, they could have aliens there, right? Right? Considering it took decades for the US government to even admit the place existed, lots of people still believe there's shady stuff going on at Area 51, whether UFO related or not. You can't blame them for being suspicious, that's for sure. When there's a mystery afoot, people always suspect aliens. Just ask that aliens dude on the History Channel. The real credit for establishing a permanent link between Area 51 and aliens probably goes to a guy named Bob Lazar. In 1989, Lazar, under the pseudonym Dennis, reportedly told the press that he was a former scientist who had worked in Area 51, playing a part in reverse engineering 9 extraterrestrial flying saucers. Boom, the truth was now surely out there. Once Dennis spoke out, the world flipped on its axis. Nobody stormed Area 51, but the news spread like wildfire, and Lazar's story turned Area 51 into UFO Central. Soon afterward, Lazar came forward with his true identity, claiming that his family's lives had been threatened. A lot of what made Lazar's story stick, and why it continues to gain support to this day, is because he's clearly a smart guy. Back in 1989, for example, he explained that the supposed alien spaceship used element 115, aka Moscovium, to manipulate gravity for its propulsion system. An impressive concept, since that element didn't get synthesized in a lab until 2003. This isn't quite the smoking gun it sounds like, though. While Lazar's descriptions were certainly knowledgeable, it's also the sort of concept a clever science fiction author could cook up with some research. Lazar has credibility issues too, as his claim of studying physics at MIT doesn't line up with MIT's records. Still, he has many followers. Again, the official government line is that there are no flying saucers in Area 51. There have been plenty of UFO sightings in the area, but these are generally chalked up to people misinterpreting real military tests. For example, imagine if you were in the 1970s and you saw something like a modern stealth fighter zoom by above your head. Wouldn't you be freaked out? Plus, once enough people say there are UFOs in a certain area, people tend to see more UFOs. So it goes. That said, the CIA's declassified documents did contain at least one section regarding UFOs, which discusses something called Operation Blue Book. The CIA reportedly noted a dramatic increase in UFO sightings after the U-2 started being test flown from Area 51, and while this seems like an obvious case of cause and effect, they did want to make sure this was their doing, just in case. So they recorded UFO sightings, documented them, and compared the locations against US aircraft flight logs to check that nothing funny was going on. Using this method, Blue Book officials were able to confirm that the majority of UFO sightings matched military aircraft flight patterns. Note the word majority, though. This terminology doesn't prove anything, and it's easy to jump to conclusions, but it is a word choice commonly seized upon by UFO folks. Again, believe what you will. If you're wondering how the US government is legally able to keep people from entering Area 51, well, it's enshrined in federal law, Section 1382 of Title 18 of the US Code to be precise. Area 51 is surrounded by signs warning trespassers that they could be subject to deadly force, heavy fines, and/or prison time. How seriously do they take these laws, though? After all, would they really shoot someone who charged past the barriers? Well, yes, actually.
If you cross that border, they have the right to shoot you.
In January 2019, the Nevada National Security Site, of which Area 51 is just a small part, reported that an unidentified man holding a cylindrical object had broken in, driven 8 miles past the security gate, and ignored the commands of the officers who intercepted him. Yes, they shot him, and yes, he's dead now. A less deadly incident occurred in 2014 when a guided tour vehicle carrying 4 passengers accidentally crossed the boundary. 2 minutes later, the guards roared out in a white truck, stopped the bus, and issued misdemeanor charges and $650 fines for each person in the bus, passengers included. Thankfully, the charges were dropped for the passengers, but the driver was barred from doing Area 51 tours for 2 years. The truth is, nobody actually knows why exactly this mysterious base is called Area 51. This name was first discovered on diagrams from the 1960s, and it's possible that the name is just a relic from the Atomic Energy Commission, which used a grid naming system to title the various safety experiment locations within the land of Nellis Air Force Base. That said, Area 51 is far from the only name this location has had, and it's doubtful that those who work there call it that. If anything, they probably think of it as Groom Lake. The location's airport identifier code is KXTA, with another official name for it being the quaint title of Homey Airport. Because top-secret military installations are so homey, right? Maybe it's a reference to E.T.'s phone.
E.T. Home phone.
Anyway, plenty of Area 51 nicknames have appeared throughout the years, all of which sound straight out of a science fiction horror movie. These include Dreamland, The Box, The Ranch, or simply enough, The Remote Location. That doesn't sound creepy or sinister at all. Nobody goes into Area 51 unless they're invited, but the surrounding region has, predictably enough, flowered with exactly the sort of alien-themed tourism you'd hope to find in such a location. Nevada State Route 375 was named the Extraterrestrial Highway in 1996, and the area welcomes visitors from any planet to enjoy the various museums, restaurants, and hotels dedicated to the little green dudes. Outside of Roswell, New Mexico, or the annual Exeter UFO Festival in New Hampshire, it's hard to find a more alien-friendly spot. Well, except their homeworlds. Tourists shouldn't expect to actually go inside Area 51, though. Also, don't believe all the hype. While salespeople love to claim that Nevada sees more annual UFO sightings than anywhere else in the country, USA Today reports that this honor actually belongs to Vermont, followed by Oregon. Nevada, for what it's worth, ranks at number 13. By now, everyone has heard about how millions of people are allegedly going to storm Area 51 to see them aliens. But despite how many outlets are spinning the story, the whole thing started off as a pretty obvious joke. The original Facebook page for the event is obviously satirical, considering that it's telling people to dodge bullets with the power of a Naruto run, among other things. The event page itself is mostly just an excuse for extraterrestrial fans to share silly, weird, and occasionally profound memes, as well as battle strategies for when the raid happens, which it definitely will. Will 1 million people actually fly out there though? Probably not, but in today's world, who knows? That said, the US military has made it clear that they are not going to have any sense of humor about the whole thing, with Air Force spokeswoman Laura McAndrews telling the Washington Post that they were not only aware of the event, but ready for it. As she told reporters, Area 51 is an open training range for the US Air Force, and we would discourage anyone from trying to come into the area where we train American armed forces. The US Air Force always stands ready to protect America and its assets. Another person discouraging would-be stormers, interestingly enough, is Bob Lazar himself. On Instagram, Lazar recognized the humorous intention of the event, but called anyone seriously considering an Area 51 run misguided, explaining that any of the alleged alien tech he worked on was probably moved ages ago.
4-star General George S. Patton was one of the preeminent military figures of World War II. Under his leadership, American troops reversed the Allies' fortunes in North Africa, liberated Sicily, and saved the U.S. troops threatened with annihilation during the Nazi counterattack known as the Battle of the Bulge. A West Point graduate, Patton was seriously wounded during his service in World War I and cheated death more than once, making headlines for his outspoken opinions about the conduct of the Second World War and earning the nickname Old Blood and Guts.
Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser.
With such a controversial, storied career, few would have predicted that the warrior would meet his end in a hospital bed in his sleep after a car accident. By mid-1945, the war in Europe was won. Patton had requested an assignment commanding troops in the South Pacific, where the U.S. was finishing its fight against the Japanese Empire, but he was refused. Instead, Patton was assigned as military governor of Bavaria, where he hired former Nazis to help run the district and publicly spewed anti-Semitic sentiments at Holocaust victims. His private conduct, though, worried his superiors even more, as he was agitating to team up with the remnants of the German army to continue the war against America's Soviet allies. In October 1945, Dwight Eisenhower relieved Patton of command and gave him a desk job overseeing a history of the European campaign. It was a harsh blow for Patton, a man of action. He confided in his wife that he would be home for Christmas and might then retire. He became moody and withdrawn, so his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, suggested they go on a hunting trip to lift Patton's spirits. It was a fateful decision, one that had been rehashed and reenacted ever since in films like The Last Days of Patton. On December 8th, 2 days before he was scheduled to return to America, Patton was riding in the backseat of a car with Gay through the suburbs of Mannheim, Germany, when an army truck abruptly cut them off. Gay and the driver braced themselves for impact, but Patton had been looking out the side window and didn't see the truck. The impact threw him forward against the metal frame of the glass partition between the front and back seats. He remained conscious, although his head was cut to the bone. His neck was damaged as well, and he said, quote, "I think I'm paralyzed." He added a little later, quote, "This is a hell of a way to die." Patton was transported by ambulance to a hospital about 15 miles away, where it was determined that he had fractured and dislocated vertebrae and was paralyzed from the neck down. On December 11th, his wife flew in from the States to be with him. Given the state of medicine in those times, it was impossible to operate on Patton's neck in order to relieve the paralysis. Patton himself seemed resigned to his fate. When he saw his wife, he said to her, "I'm afraid, Bee, this may be the last time we see each other." On December 20th, an X-ray revealed a pulmonary embolism in his right lung. The next day, another struck in his left lung, this time fatally. Patton was buried in a U.S. military cemetery in Luxembourg. Almost immediately, rumors began to circulate that Patton had been the victim of an assassination plot, despite all evidence to the contrary. And those bizarre conspiracy theories have continued even to this day. In 2014, for instance, Bill O'Reilly, who was then a fixture of Fox News, published Killing Patton as part of a series of books which speculate wildly about the deaths of famous historical figures. O'Reilly claimed that Patton was killed under orders from Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, telling USA Today, "We believe he was poisoned in the hospital." Historians immediately weighed in on the O'Reilly theory, pronouncing it complete and utter rubbish. Carlo Diest, the author of Patton, A Genius for War, told Media Matters for America, "You've got to look at what Patton's situation was. He was a quadriplegic. He was going to die anyway. He was totally immobilized. He couldn't move. What is the point of assassinating him, and where did Stalin come from anyway? Sure, somebody could have snuck in the hospital, but why would you bother? You need to verify facts." And the sad fact is that one of America's preeminent warriors actually died in a routine traffic accident.
Buffalo Soldiers were a real thing, not just a reggae song. Buffalo Soldiers were some of the bravest and most decorated soldiers to serve in the United States military, and yet their accomplishments aren't very well known because of racism. This is the untold truth of the Buffalo Soldiers. During the American Civil War, all black regiments called the United States Colored Troops made up roughly 10% of the Union Army. Those troops were disbanded at the end of the war, and a lot of newly free blacks in other parts of the nation found themselves facing difficult circumstances. In 1866, Congress passed the Army Organization Act, which was mostly just a lot of fluff about pay for soldiers and officers and organizational stuff. But the act also allowed for the creation of 4 new cavalry regiments, 2 of which would consist of black soldiers and white officers, and 8 new companies of infantry, 4 of which would consist of black soldiers and white officers. Many free blacks saw this as a rare opportunity and perhaps their only one to make a decent living. These were considered peacetime regiments, but peacetime isn't really a super accurate word since there was still plenty of conflict happening in the American West, mostly against the indigenous population. The American Civil War freed blacks from slavery, but not from oppression. They weren't equal under the law. They faced ugly, out in the open racism, whether they were in southern states, northern states, or the frontier. A lot of blacks saw military service as a pathway to civil rights, if they could prove themselves in uniform. Surely equal rights and fair treatment would follow. Unfortunately, military service post-Civil War meant fighting for the oppression of another group, Indigenous Americans. According to history, The original purpose of the Buffalo Soldiers was to keep the natives from causing trouble. They were to help with the westward expansion, which meant fighting and pushing back the native people. Though that wasn't their only task, they had other responsibilities too, like catching cattle rustlers and protecting settlers on the frontier. All nice, not very visible jobs, which was important because the white folks living in populated communities might die from shock if they saw black men dressed in army uniforms carrying weapons. Buffalo Soldiers is a pretty odd name, and no one is really sure exactly why it was given to black soldiers on the frontier. According to history, the two all-black cavalry units were officially the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, and it was the Native Americans that the men were supposed to be controlling who gave them the nickname Buffalo Soldiers. But their reasons for choosing that particular moniker are mostly a mystery. One theory suggests that the natives thought the soldiers' thick, curly hair resembled the fur of a buffalo, but that frankly seems like an idea someone might have pulled out of their own backside. The more popular and probably correct theory is that the Buffalo Soldiers fought courageously and fiercely, so the Plains people named them after the buffalo, an animal they had a deep respect and reverence for. Origins aside, it's clear that the soldiers themselves saw the nickname as one of respect, and even incorporated the image of a buffalo into their coat of arms. You will, of course, be absolutely shocked to hear that not everyone was cool with the idea of all-black regiments, and that there was a ton of racism thrown at the Buffalo Soldiers for pretty much their entire existence. According to Smithsonian, the first thing that happened was white officers, including the famous jerk George Armstrong Custer, refused to command them because they believed black men would run when faced with danger. Nice. Some of the officers who refused to command Buffalo Soldiers even risked losing rank, and that still wasn't enough to overcome their racism. The all-black regiments would also get all of the worst food, the worst horses, and the crappiest equipment, and most of their accomplishments went totally unrecognized. They were often living in unsanitary conditions, and many of them died from disease related to their living conditions and inadequate rations. Meanwhile, the white officers got everything they needed because, of course, they did.
You really think you can keep 700 Union soldiers without proper shoes because you think it's funny?
Anyone who's ever watched a film about life in the army during the American Civil War knows that, according to Hollywood, white soldiers were mostly louts who drank a lot and got court-martialed all the time.
Come on! You prissy little schoolgirl! You're the worst soldier in this whole company, now hit me!
That's not entirely a figment of Hollywood's imagination, though. There's an element of truth to it. In both the Union Army and the Confederate one, officers and soldiers drank to cope with boredom and the general awfulness of fighting in a civil war, and whiskey was given to soldiers as medicine to treat things like exhaustion and pain.
Look, have a drink.
Not much really changed after the war either. White soldiers continued to use alcohol, but the Buffalo Soldiers had much lower rates of alcohol use, even though they got the worst and most dangerous assignments and faced racism from their superiors and from the citizens of the frontier towns they were assigned to protect. They had lower rates of court-martial and desertion too. So even though life was a lot more challenging for them, they were, on the whole, more disciplined than their white counterparts were. At first, pretty much everyone was against the Buffalo Soldiers, except maybe for those faraway people in Congress who wrote them into the law in 1866. Out on the frontier, people were ruthlessly cruel. According to Smithsonian, the people who were the primary beneficiaries of their service were the most hostile of all, and sometimes black soldiers died violently at the hands of ungrateful white settlers. That didn't deter the Buffalo Soldiers, though, who took their job seriously and served valiantly. During the Indian Wars, which lasted decades, 18 Buffalo Soldiers were given Medals of Honor. Keep in mind, though, that there were 426 medals given in total during those years, and black soldiers made up roughly 10% of the army at the time. So clearly, a lot of valiant Buffalo soldiers were overlooked, and the ones that did receive medals had to do some pretty crazy heroic things to get the attention of a military leadership that was otherwise prone to overlooking them. Nothing like working twice as hard to get half the recognition. Henry O. Flipper was born into slavery in 1856. According to the National Archives, Flipper overcame enormous odds, isolation, and the near-constant harassment of classmates to become the first black graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and the first black commissioned officer in the United States Army. Flipper graduated in 1877 and was stationed on the frontier in Oklahoma and Texas. He fought Apaches during the Indian Wars and helped build the infrastructure that made life easier for settlers. Unfortunately, Flipper's distinguished record couldn't protect him from racism, and in 1881, his commanding officer accused him of embezzling money from commissary funds. He was cleared of the charges, but the court found him guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer, and he received a dishonorable discharge. Despite efforts to clear his name, Flipper died before the army finally recognized its error and granted him an honorable discharge. In 1999, he was finally pardoned by then-President Bill Clinton. No matter where they went, the Buffalo Soldiers got the crappiest, most thankless jobs going, but some jobs were less terrible than others. According to the National Park Service, 500 Buffalo Soldiers got to do thankless work in two of the most beautiful places in the world, Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks, where they were tasked with catching timber thieves, confiscating firearms, kicking out cattle found grazing on parklands, and stopping illegal poaching. Many also served as firefighters and were responsible for helping bring infrastructure into the parks. They built roads and trails and constructed an arboretum in Yosemite National Park, which became the first museum ever built in a national park. In 1903, West Point's third black graduate, Charles Young, served as acting military superintendent in Sequoia National Park. Young and his all-black company were sent to Sequoia to work on a stalled road project. By the end of the season, Young and his men had built as much road as had been built in the 3 previous seasons. And yet, most Americans today aren't even aware of what the all-black regiments accomplished in their beloved national parks. By the time the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, blacks in America were still nursing hope that distinguished service in the military was the key to obtaining equal rights at home. Even though more than 30 years later, things had still not changed for the Buffalo Soldiers. There was a fierce debate about whether black soldiers were doing any good for black civil rights. Still, when the army shipped 17,000 men to Cuba to fight in the new conflict, 3,000 of them were Buffalo Soldiers. The Spanish-American War marked the first time that black troops were stationed in the southeastern part of America, where they faced the same bigotry that their unenlisted counterparts did. When they arrived in Cuba, they faced heat, mud, and tropical diseases. Many of them served as nurses and orderlies. 4 earned Medals of Honor for rescuing wounded soldiers under enemy fire, being praised as being most gallant and soldierly. But still, nothing really changed back home. By World War I, the Buffalo Soldiers had an impressive list of honors and accomplishments, and still weren't considered equal to their white counterparts. According to the National Park Service, when the United States entered the First World War, there were Buffalo Soldiers stationed in the Philippines, on the US-Mexican border, and Hawaii, and the army just kind of left them there. Because despite all the evidence to the contrary, they didn't think they were capable enough to send to the front lines. But as the war grew uglier and nastier and longer, the military finally conceded to a simple fact. The war wasn't going to be won if the US didn't enlist the help of everyone, regardless of color. The Buffalo Soldiers themselves remained in the United States and the Philippines, but thousands of African Americans were eventually recruited to join the war overseas. And it's safe to say that the distinguished history of the Buffalo Soldiers helped make that possible. One of the 2 divisions that shipped to France during the First World War was nicknamed Buffalo Soldiers, even though it wasn't part of the original regiments that bore that name. The other unit became known as Blue Helmets. Both fought in France during World War I, and both served so valiantly that France awarded honours and medals to soldiers in each division. And still, black soldiers weren't taken seriously back home in America. By World War II, there were 909,000 enlisted blacks in the army, but only 1 division saw combat. The rest of them were assigned to menial jobs like construction or graves registration because of the enduring belief that black soldiers weren't brave enough or motivated enough for combat. The 92nd Infantry Division, the last racially segregated unit in the United States military, was the only exception. And surprise, they fought just as valiantly as all the Buffalo Soldiers who came before them. The Buffalo Soldiers had a long, proud history, but they couldn't continue to exist in a world that was finally starting to recognize the fundamental injustice of segregation. And the desegregation of the military had an unlikely champion, Harry S. Truman, who grew up with racist ideas and eventually evolved into a person who genuinely believed that all people were equal. According to the Washington Post, he had a deep change of heart upon learning of an attack on a decorated black World War II veteran named Isaac Woodard, who was beaten and blinded by a South Carolina police chief.
He wasn't drunk at all, but he got hit over the head with the blackjack and hit across the face with a billy club and blinded him for life.
Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which desegregated the United States military. The same day, he signed an executive order for the desegregation of the federal workforce, saying, "There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." The history of black men in the United States military is remarkable. But what about the history of black women in the military? Well, for a long time, that entire history was just limited to one person, Cadet Williams, the only female Buffalo Soldier. Williams was born into slavery in 1844. According to the National Park Service, after Union soldiers captured her hometown in 1861, Williams served as an army cook and laundress and spent time traveling with the Union Army, where she learned the routine of life on the front lines. At the end of the Civil War, Williams realized that one of the best employment opportunities open to blacks was soldiering. That opportunity wasn't open to her though, just as it wasn't open to any women. But instead of finding work as a cook or laundress elsewhere, she traveled to St. Louis, changed her name to William Cadet, and became a Buffalo Soldier. Williams successfully passed as a man for 2 years. She never saw combat, but she learned to use a musket, went on scouting missions, and served as a guard. It wasn't until a series of illnesses that she was finally outed as a woman in 1868. Even after she'd been found out though, her superiors had enough respect for her accomplishments that she was granted an honorable discharge. The last Buffalo Soldier was Mark Matthews, who died at the age of 111 in 2005. According to the LA Times, Matthews was already an accomplished horseman when he joined the 10th Cavalry in Lexington, Kentucky at the age of 15. Matthews served along the US-Mexican border during World War I, and in 1931 he transferred to Fort Myer, Virginia, where he taught horsemanship to new recruits. He retired from the Army in 1949, and after working as a security guard, finally retired for good in 1970 after becoming Chief of the Guards. When Matthews died, he was the last surviving Buffalo Soldier and also the oldest at 111. And it's pretty cool that the Buffalo Soldiers made it to the 21st century after such a long and impressive history of valor and patriotism. Thank you for your service.
Turncoat or tragedy? Flight or foul play? The inexplicable disappearance of Richard Cox remains a compelling mystery. Richard Colvin Cox was born in Mansfield, Ohio in 1928, and after graduating high school, Cox volunteered for the United States Constabulary. That was a force organized in the wake of World War II, tasked with providing security and policing services in a shattered Germany. He was assigned to a unit in Coburg, Germany, and the military life obviously appealed to him. Life reports he applied to and entered West Point as a student in 1948. All the evidence points to Cox being well suited for military life. His service in Germany was quite admirable, and when he applied to West Point, his application was supported by his superiors and went through without a problem. Once in West Point, he continued to thrive in the military lifestyle. By all reports, he did well at the academy. He ranked in the upper third of his class and had no blemishes on his record. Richard Cox seemed on his way to having a solid, if not exemplary, military career, and most importantly, he seemed well suited for such a life. When someone vanishes without a trace, it's easy to imagine they must have been terribly unhappy or in some kind of trouble. Why else would you walk out of your life and never look back, leaving friends, family, and lovers with no closure? But according to the Washington Post, in the days and weeks before Richard Colvin Cox vanished, there were exactly 0 clues that he was contemplating such a dramatic decision. Right up until the day before his disappearance, he remained in contact with his fiancée Betty and his mother Minnie, who stated that there had been no indication he was contemplating leaving West Point, and that she had no reason to suspect any sort of crime. Cox had, in fact, just returned from Christmas vacation at home with his family, and according to Life was, at most, sometimes depressed. However, that's hardly unusual for young people in high-pressure environments like West Point. Cox spent a day taking in a basketball game with his roommate Dean E. Welch, not exactly the actions of a worried man, and then on January 14, 1950, he vanished without a trace. Here's where things start to get dark. According to Life, 1 week before Cox disappeared, a man telephoned his barracks asking for Dick Cox and left his name as George. He stated that they knew each other from Germany. The Washington Post reports that Cox met with George but offered a negative impression of the man to his roommates. He'd made a few shocking comments about George, saying he'd boasted about how many men he'd killed and that he'd murdered a girlfriend when she became pregnant.
Wow, sounds like a cool guy. Sounds like a jerk.
A week later, Cox once again met a civilian friend and signed himself out for dinner. Although it seems very likely it was the same man, there were differences in how the civilian was described by a different set of witnesses. When Cox returned to his room, however, he had indicated it was George and that they had again made plans to have dinner together. Unfortunately, George was never identified, despite an intense search for him after Cox's disappearance. The Washington Post makes it clear that there's a strong possibility of foul play when it comes to the matter of Cox's disappearance, especially considering that his behavior wasn't entirely innocent. According to Hudson Valley Magazine, when Cox left the barracks with his mysterious friend George a week before his disappearance, the two men simply sat in George's car drinking whiskey. Cox returned to his room intoxicated and quickly passed out at his desk. His roommates, amused, even took a photo of him as he slept as a prank. Author Harry J. Mayhofer describes some of Cox's more suspicious behavior in his book Oblivion, The Mystery of West Point Cadet Richard Cox, noting that at some point Cox crept from his room and altered the entry in the barracks logbook to make it seem as if he'd returned an hour earlier than he actually had. This was a violation of the cadet honor code at West Point, and it may have resulted in his expulsion if discovered, so it wasn't something a cadet would do lightly. What was so important about that hour? When Cox arrived at West Point, he was engaged to a woman named Betty Timmons back in Ohio. However, things took an interesting turn as Cox slept off his first meeting with George. Front Page Detectives reports that at some point, Cox woke from his drunken slumber, ran out into the hall, and shouted the name Alice. His roommate asked him who Alice was, but Cox ignored him, returned to his room, and fell asleep again. Since Cox's fiancée was named Betty, this could be a clue as to his eventual fate, or his relationship to the mysterious man named George. But no Alice has ever been identified in connection with Cox. It's been speculated that Alice might have been a girlfriend of Cox's in Germany, but no such woman has ever been found. When Richard Colvin Cox initially disappeared, the focus of most theories was foul play. Had Cox been kidnapped, murdered, suffered a breakdown? West Point continued to list Cox as away without official leave, or AWOL, instead of charging him with the more serious crime of desertion. But there was no evidence to support any of these theories, really, which has led some to posit the other possibility, that despite the appearance of happiness, Cox voluntarily vanished and left his life behind and never looked back. Assembly notes that a review of Cox's writings reveals some dissatisfaction with his West Point experience and some doubts about marrying Betty. Front Page Detectives reports that January 15, 1950, the day after his disappearance, was circled on his calendar with no indication as to why. And for years after Cox's disappearance, people reported seeing him. The tantalizing possibility remains that Cox left his life behind, assumed a new identity, and spent the rest of his days hiding from his family and old friends. It may be tempting to simply chalk up Cox's disappearance to a young man looking to flee his obligations. However, there's evidence against the idea that he simply abandoned his own life to start anew as well. One reason many people don't believe Cox had a plan to disappear deliberately is the fact that he left several items behind in his room that would have been extremely useful to him if he had. First, as reported in Oblivion, he left behind a large sum of money. A search of his room after his disappearance found $60 in cash and a check for $25 made out to him. In today's money, that would have been worth more than $1,000. He also left a gold watch that his roommate stated he had seemed to value highly. According to front-page detectives, Cox also left 2 suitcases of civilian clothing behind in his room. They had just been returned from the cleaners, yet he left them there and wore his uniform and gray overcoat when he left, making it very difficult for him to blend in once he left the West Point grounds. Life reports that it took some time for the alarm to sound concerning Cox's disappearance. He was officially due back in his room by 11 p.m. at night, but cadets were routinely late and no one thought much about his failure to turn up. It wasn't until the next morning that Cox was officially reported missing. Richland's source reports that what ensued was one of the largest manhunts ever staged in U.S. history. Helicopters were deployed to search the West Point grounds for a body, and soldiers were brought in to form search parties. The pool was drained, and every nearby building was searched. The massive manhunt went on for 2 long months and turned up exactly 0 clues. West Point continued to call Cox's name at roll call every morning for 3 months, finally removing him from the rolls on March 15, 1950. The Washington Post says that in 1957, the state of Ohio officially declared him dead. The investigation remained a cold case. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence suggesting Cox may have vanished on purpose was noted by the Washington Post. Purportedly, Cox was spotted some 4 years after his disappearance at a Greyhound bus station in Washington, D.C. He was seen there by a man named Ernest J. Shotwell Jr., who had attended the U.S. Military Academy Preparatory School with Cox a few years before his entry into West Point and subsequent disappearance. According to Shotwell, he wasn't aware that Cox was missing when he saw him, and he reported that Cox seemed ill at ease and evaded questions about his future. Per Oblivion, Shotwell was asked if he would be willing to take a lie detector test to support his claims, and he said that he would. By 1950, the Cold War was in full swing and provided a backdrop for what was a very real concern. As historian Yohuru Williams explains,
during the 1940s and 1950s, many Americans worried about the prospects of communism rearing its head within the United States.
So when Cox vanished from West Point, it's no surprise that some investigators looked at the case through the lens of espionage, and it didn't come up entirely empty. According to Oblivion, notes Cox left behind indicated he was making an attempt to learn how to speak Russian. The Washington Post reports this was confirmed in a letter Cox had written to a woman in Germany just a few weeks before his disappearance, in which he also asked pointedly, "What is the Russian situation in Lichtenfels and vicinity? I'm very interested in the Russian situation." The rest of the contents of the letter were pretty generic, harmless stuff, with Cox simply desiring correspondence and expressing uncertainty that the woman would even remember who he was. Neither of these pieces of evidence proves anything, of course, but considering how thoroughly he vanished, the possibility that he crossed over to the Soviets at the height of the Cold War can't be completely discounted. Hudson Valley Magazine reports that Cox served as an intelligence officer, and there are reasons to think it possible that Cox's 1950 disappearance had everything to do with becoming a spy. According to Richland's source, an old friend of Cox's, William F. McKee, eventually became Richland County prosecutor. While in the Ohio FBI office one day, McKee asked to see the bureau's file on Cox, and the agent became flustered and gave excuses why the file couldn't be produced. A few years later, he made another request to see the Cox file, and once again, the files never showed up. In 1982, a journalist was finally able to get the Cox file and discovered it was heavily censored, and 165 pages were simply missing. The whole experience implies that someone in a position to do so wanted to prevent anyone from seeing the results of the investigation into Cox's disappearance. It may be possible the FBI wanted to keep the details secret due to the embarrassment over the lack of progress. However, it's also consistent with the idea that Cox, who had experience working in intelligence, was recruited by the CIA or some other agency. In Oblivion, author Harry J. Mayhofer reports on the likelihood that Cox was recruited into the CIA. At the time of his disappearance, the CIA was actively recruiting former soldiers with experience serving outside the U.S.
We will now determine your G-force threshold. Just relax, gentlemen.
I guess we just sit here?
Since Cox had some experience working in intelligence in Germany, he was ideally qualified. Some investigators speculated that the mysterious man called George, who visited Cox shortly before he vanished, was in fact a man named David Westervelt. Westervelt had supervised Cox in Germany and may have been a recruiter for the CIA. According to Front Page Detectives, a former FBI agent stated that the Bureau had been within 24 hours of catching Cox, but were abruptly removed from the case, leading them to suggest that a higher authority was protecting him. In fact, a highly placed CIA officer confirmed that Richard Colvin Cox was still alive but had no desire to come forward and speak to anyone. The CIA contact also implied that Cox was ill with cancer and on his deathbed. The possibility that this was a falsehood designed to discourage further inquiry is possible, of course, and the disappearance of Richard Colvin Cox remains a mystery to this day. When it comes to weapons, war is unsurprisingly the mother of invention. The need to gain an upper hand has led to plenty of advances in combat over the centuries, and some of them have been rather strange. Here are some of the most bizarre weapons ever used by soldiers in war. By the early 20th century, chainmail's heyday had long passed. This archaic armor was no match for machine guns, tanks, and bombs, but it nevertheless found its unexpected last hurrah in the trenches among British tank crews. During World War I, tanks rolled through enemy lines and cleared out areas for infantry advances. Their heavy exterior armor protected them and made them difficult to destroy, but they weren't invulnerable. Drivers still faced the repeated impact of machine gun fire, shells, and grenades in their poorly ventilated compartments. As shells and bullets repeatedly pounded tank exteriors, crews suffered flurries of hot metal shrapnel that could burn their faces. So the British improvised a special mask to protect their tank crews. This mask protected the eyes and left slits for visibility, and the lower half of the mask was chainmail. It was meant to capture shrapnel in its rings and protect the mouth and chin of the tank crewmen. That sounds ingenious, although it's unclear how well it actually worked. The lasso is a simple piece of rope with a loop at the end that conjures nostalgic images of the Old West. Back in the ancient world, it doubled as a cheap and deadly weapon. On the Eurasian steppe, metal was scarce. The nomadic inhabitants relied on armor and weapons made from a mix of wood, hide, and horn. Metal weapons were more frequently found among the aristocracies of steppe societies, so common warriors had to make do with weapons like bows. Others preferred the lasso. According to the Greek travel writer Pausanias, the Iranian Sarmatians were masters with the lasso. A favorite tactic of these master riders was to charge an opponent and lasso him off his horse. The Sarmatian warrior would then drag his opponent back to his lines, assuming he survived the initial fall. Lassos appear throughout the Iranian-speaking steppe world and were immortalized in the Iranian epic poem The Shahnameh, in which legendary warrior Rostam defeats his opponent by lassoing him and pulling him off his horse. Although medieval warfare was plenty bloody, the goal wasn't always to kill enemies. When it came to higher-ranking foes, it was sometimes lucrative to capture them instead. But capturing an enemy wasn't always easy. To solve this problem, someone devised a terrifying-looking weapon called the man-catcher. This device consisted of a metal pole with a claw of sorts at its end. The tips were spiked, allowing it to dig into an armored enemy enough to immobilize him but not excessively harm him. If used correctly, the wielder could snatch a foe off his horse and drag him back for ransom, assuming he survived. Although the man-catcher disappeared from the battlefields as gunpowder took over, evidence suggests that law enforcement kept using it in Europe to capture criminals without killing them. Versions of it are still used today in some countries for riot control and non-lethal restraint. In 1544, English King Henry VIII received an offer from an Italian man named Giovanni Battista di Ravenna, who proposed that Henry arm his gunners with gun shields. The idea behind this strange weapon made sense, but its execution was lacking. Henry gave permission to have his bodyguard experiment with the weapon before trying it out on the battlefield. The idea was to place a shield with a hole in it through which a firearm could be inserted. The gunner would thereby be protected from enemy fire while still being able to see and shoot his enemies through a grill in the shield at eye level. Although Battista's idea was theoretically well thought out, there was one major problem, as the shield was too heavy and made it impossible for the gunner to fire his weapon.
Oh, this is heavy.
The only way to fire the gun was to place the shield on a stand or some other support. Thus, it was easier to fire the gun unprotected without the shield. The idea was abandoned for infantrymen, although it was possibly repurposed for ships, where gunners could use the deck for support. During the 15th century, a firebrand preacher named Jan Hus spoke out against the Roman Catholic Church. After his execution for heresy in 1415, his followers, known as Hussites, spread throughout the modern Czech Republic. In 1419, they rose in revolt against the Holy Roman Empire. From 1419 to 1436, Crusaders and Hussites fought across Bohemia. Although the Hussites were outnumbered and under-equipped, they devised an ingenious wagon-based weapon to negate the imperial army's most powerful arm, its knights. Wagons had been used in war since ancient times. So while the Hussite use of wagons wasn't new, their bizarre-looking modifications made them virtually impregnable. Under Jan Žižka, the old commander of the Bohemian Royal Guard, the Hussites developed the Wagenburg. Žižka reinforced the wagons with wood panels on all sides, and each wagon became a mobile fort filled with gunners, slingers, crossbowmen, and pikemen. The Hussite wagon fort was devastatingly effective, and it defeated 5 Crusader armies. This tactic was so successful that it spread to Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and eventually all the way to India. Eventually, though, heavier, more powerful field artillery would negate the advantage of the war wagon. But during its time, this simple yet ingenious weapon ruled the battlefields of Eastern Europe. A dead man cannot fight, but during the Middle Ages, deceased soldiers sometimes proved more useful than living ones. During this time, it was generally understood that plague could spread from person to person, even if the causes weren't fully yet understood. In 1346, the inhabitants of the Genoese city of Caffa discovered to their horror how an infected man could fight even in death.
Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
At the time, Caffa was a bustling merchant city, though its Catholic majority often clashed with its Muslim neighbors, who were subject to the Mongol Golden Horde. After one dispute led to violence, the Golden Horde laid siege to the city in 1346. With naval dominance in the Black Sea, Genoa could reinforce and resupply the city by sea. Meanwhile, the Black Death had spread via the Silk Road into southern Russia. The pestilence stuck the besiegers, killing many and forcing them to abandon the siege. Before leaving, the furious Mongol commander sent the defenders one last grisly souvenir. As the Tatars dismantled the siege lines, they loaded dead bodies of their own men onto catapults and flung them over the walls. Many of Caffa's inhabitants fled the city, hoping to escape the plague, but in doing so, they inadvertently brought it first to Constantinople and Anatolia, and then eventually to Italy. This unconventional warfare on the Mongols' part accelerated the spread of the plague, which ravaged Caffa and killed over a quarter of Europe's population, a fitting revenge. Following the conquest of eastern Poland in 1939, the Soviet Union attacked Finland. The Finnish army fought back in a brutal conflict called the Winter War, as a country of 4 million people attempted to preserve its liberty against communism. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Finns would not be easily bowed. The Finns' main problem was their lack of anti-tank guns. To compensate, they transformed crude Spanish petrol bombs into a sort of sticky grenade dubbed the Finnish Molotov cocktail. Because petrol bombs often endangered the thrower as well as the target, the Finnish army completely revamped the weapon. The bottle was filled with a mix of tar, kerosene, and potassium chlorate, making for a sticky, highly flammable mixture. The bottle was then sealed tightly to prevent leakage. Ingeniously, they were lit with 2 matches on the sides. A soldier could safely light the matches and throw the bottle, ensuring that if it broke, it would light up its target.
Fire! 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 Fire!
The Finnish Molotov cocktail proved effective against Soviet tanks. It could ignite the tank and smoke out the crew, whom Finnish riflemen could then pick off at leisure. A bottle in the hatch would burn the crew alive, while a bottle to the treads would immobilize the tank. The tar ensured that the liquid stuck to clothes and skin, making an encounter with a Finnish Molotov cocktail a guaranteed death sentence for Soviet tank crews. In 1942, Germans pioneered moderately successful remote-controlled mini-tanks to fend off Allied tanks and blast through enemy fortifications. This mini-tank was called the Goliath, a misnomer considering that it was small enough to slip underneath a full-size tank while carrying up to 220 pounds of ordnance. This made it useful not just against enemy tanks, but also against pillboxes, gun emplacements, and other field fortifications. The Goliath was the latest in a string of experiments involving remote-controlled explosive delivery systems. It was controlled with a joystick that was hooked to the Goliath with an unwinding cable. This made the Goliath useless if the cable was cut. However, the amount of explosives made it extremely potent if it reached its intended target, and Goliaths were used to devastating effect during the Warsaw Uprising in World War II. Although the Goliath's problems led to its eventual abandonment, its principal contribution was in the field of robotics. British, Israeli, and American scientists all built on the principles behind the Goliath, as it created remote-controlled mine-clearing and bomb-disposing vehicles. While attempting to neutralize Germany's legendary Panzer Corps during World War II, the Soviets tried a highly unorthodox solution. It turned out to be a miserable failure and would today be considered animal abuse, but during Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet commanders created kamikaze dogs. They strapped the animals with roughly 26 pounds of TNT inside 2 pouches carried on their sides. They were trained to crawl underneath German panzers. Once they reached the underside of their targets, a spring mechanism would pull the pin on the explosives and detonate both the tank and the dog. The Soviets encountered a major problem with this weapon in addition to the animal cruelty. Often, the dogs simply refused to run toward the Germans, or worse, they would run toward their own lines and create havoc among the Soviet vehicles. Since the German tanks smelled unfamiliar due to their gas engines, the dogs were more comfortable near the more familiar Soviet diesel-powered tanks that they were trained with. This program was shelved after 1 year, but the use of animals to ferry explosives did not die. As recently as 2014, Israeli forces shot a suicide donkey bomber near a border crossing. Russia's defeat in the Crimean War exposed the country's technological backwardness, prompting Tsar Alexander III to begin modernizing the Navy. With the advent of ironclad monitors in the United States and Europe, Russia risked falling behind its global rivals. In response, they experimented with a new design, a circular ship. At the time, a Scottish engineer named John Elder had been delving into creating floating fortresses. Following Elder's lead, Russian sailor and engineer Andrei Popov decided to make the circular ship a reality. Popov and Elder noted that a circular ship would displace more water and allow a greater number of guns to be deployed on the vessel's deck. As an added advantage, much of the hull would be underwater, making it difficult to hit from the deck of another ship. So in 1873, the Russian Navy put the Novgorod to sea. Unfortunately for Popov, the Novgorod had been approved without testing. Because the ship was so oddly shaped, the rudder and propellers were too small to move it, and the vessel was unstable when unmoored even in calm waters. Ultimately, the Novgorod was only utilized briefly during the Russo-Turkish War in 1877. It was assigned to coastal defense afterward and eventually scuppered in 1903 as dreadnoughts and other steel steamers came to rule the seas. You can't simply walk into American military bases anytime you please. Their tendency towards secrecy thus leads to plenty of curiosity on the public's part. So when it comes to US military facilities, there are still some pretty mysterious ones out there, even today. From the outside, Frederick, Maryland's Fort Detrick may look like a pretty standard military installation. It has a sprawling campus that hosts one of the United States military's most terrifying and secret initiatives, biological weapons. It all started around 1950. That's when the US Army determined that Fort Detrick, a mere 50 miles or so from Washington, D.C., would be the best place where the military would begin developing and testing biological weapons. At the time, it was kept top secret as scientists created various bioweapons. The program was retired in 1969 and replaced by a bioweapons defense program, which is still active today. Fort Detrick was also the central base for the CIA program known as MK-Ultra, in which sometimes unwitting test subjects were given LSD and other mind-altering drugs in an attempt to develop mind control tactics. That program remains mysterious today, in large part because many of the documents related to it were destroyed in the 70s. Fort Detrick is now home to a state-of-the-art facility meant to contain all of that potentially deadly research material. The origins of operations at the Cheyenne Mountain Complex are so notoriously particular that it's become a standard for hush-hush military installations. Located near Colorado Springs, Colorado, it's understandable why so much of the facility's operations have been kept quiet over the years, considering its history. As reported by Wired, the true heyday of the complex came shortly after its completion in the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War. The complex is buried deep into the side of its namesake mountain, and with its network of tunnels and life support systems, it provided an attractive bunker in the event of a nearby nuclear attack. The shielding provided by the granite does much of the work, along with earthquake-resistant architecture and plenty of shielding for all the electronics. Though reporters are occasionally invited inside for a limited tour of the facilities, much of what goes on inside Cheyenne Mountain Complex is still shrouded in secrecy. It needs to be, as it once housed operations for the North American Aerospace Defense Command and other monitoring and defense networks. The complex is now a backup command and training center, though many wonder if such an extensive and heavily shielded facility is really being allowed to sit more or less dormant in a tumultuous world.
The base itself is a wonder of technology and engineering.
One of the most notorious military bases of all time, the installation known as Area 51 remains locked down. In part, that's because it's located in the remote Nevada desert, but officials have also gone to great lengths to remain mum about it. It's been such a big secret that the US government didn't even acknowledge its existence until 2013. Many speculate that this is because Area 51, officially known as Groom Lake, is all about espionage. If you were a government official who managed a program meant to monitor Soviet activity during the Cold War, you probably wouldn't publicize your work. The secrecy has led to some pretty wild conspiracy theories over the years. Some of the more mundane ones speculate that Area 51 is a top-secret testing ground for espionage equipment and high-tech aircraft. Meanwhile, the more out-there theories maintain that it's not just spy planes at Groom Lake, but instead extraterrestrial craft, perhaps even complete with alien pilots. But with security contractors patrolling the perimeter and access to the site highly restricted, no one on the outside knows for sure.
So now the government has admitted Area 51 exists, but that is about all.
As far as mysterious military installations go, it makes sense that any place dealing with high-tech intelligence and surveillance would be pretty locked down. After high-profile leaks from former contractors and military employees like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, you can be certain that security measures around these places are at a high level. And that's precisely why some intelligence facilities are so compelling to those of us on the outside. Take the Utah Data Center operated by the National Security Administration. As reported by The Atlantic, many have wondered why it would be located in Utah, though the state certainly has plenty of remote areas and a distinct lack of natural disasters. Local communities have also given the NSA a sweet deal on water rights and other infrastructure needs. So what exactly is happening at this NSA data center? All anyone seems to feel confident about is that it likely stores massive amounts of data collected via any number of undisclosed methods. As reported by NPR, many people assume that quite a lot of that data is harvested directly from American citizens and their communications. While administrators have plainly stated that they don't hold such data and instead focus on foreign targets, the lack of detail has been met with plenty of skepticism. The nature of a top-secret military bunker is that it must be kept, well, secret. It may seem like a fun mystery to people on the outside, but the very nature of such an installation means that people in the know absolutely must keep their mouths shut. That's a big reason why people are so interested in Virginia's Mount Weather, a highly secretive military installation about an hour from Washington, D.C. In part, that's because Mount Weather is a bit of an open secret. It may have been a bit more concealed in the previous years, but the events of September 11, 2001 led to a visible flood of government officials and their vehicles into the area. Reports from over the years hint at a sprawling, well-supplied complex, complete with an independent electrical system and a helipad. There's speculation that Mount Weather is just one of a series of similar sites, but that's just about all civilians seem to know about the place. The perimeter is heavily controlled, and anyone who attempts to breach the fence would likely be met with serious resistance. Some of the most mysterious U.S. military bases and facilities are actually located in overseas territories and small landholdings. And top amongst those is a base located on a small atoll that's part of the Chagas Islands in the Indian Ocean. The base in question, Diego Garcia, exists in part because of a unique agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom. In 1965, the U.S. agreed to lease the atoll from the British to create a base, but the arrangement was kept strictly secret. While other nearby nations gained independence from the British Empire, the agreement basically meant that the Chagas Islands are still under the thumb of colonial British powers, and the people who inhabited the islands were kicked off to make way for the Americans and their secretive facility. Though the agreement is now out in the open, the exact operations of Diego Garcia remain murky. Part of that's due to the pure physical distance of the place from anywhere else. But as reported by CNN, the British government has admitted that the CIA has flown in detainees, leading some people to wonder if the remote nature of the base has allowed it to become an alarmingly secretive version of Guantanamo Bay. The Alaska-based HAARP, which stands for High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, is ostensibly a government-run research effort to study our planet's upper atmosphere. But as reported by NBC, some people have speculated that it's actually to create or manage weather-based weapon systems that can cause massive storms and deadly earthquakes.
I've read some theories that HAARP can be used to manipulate the weather. Is this possible?
However, none of these conspiracy theorists have come up with a good explanation for how a weather station located in Alaska could be responsible for something like earthquakes in Haiti. Though the military claimed it was only undertaking the project because it was largely interested in how radio signals traveled through the atmosphere, its remote nature and military security has led to plenty of suspicion. Even now that HAARP has been transferred from the U.S. Air Force to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, some still cast a wary eye at this remote facility. In another context, Raven Rock Mountain Complex sounds like it could be a title of a pretty groovy prog rock album, but the reality of Raven Rock is far more locked down and potentially sinister. Reports strongly indicate that much of Raven Rock Mountain Complex is underground. According to Atlas Obscura, the site also goes by the moniker Site R, the Alternate Joint Communication Center, and more colloquially, the Underground Pentagon. As you may very well guess at this point, Raven Rock is yet another extensive government bunker that was created during the Cold War, as American officials fretted over the threat of nuclear annihilation. Located in Fairfield, Pennsylvania, it appears to be the retreat site for Pentagon personnel.
I don't know whether it's true or not. There's supposed to be some kind of an underground thing like from Virginia all the way up where they could drive up if they wanted to.
Though the site's construction was covered by local press during the 50s, it remains covered by a veil of secrecy to this day. Military representatives may send over unclassified information to reporters, but what about the classified material? No one but a small group of workers there knows exactly what is in the bunker. Though, as Wired notes, perhaps it's high time that we discarded the idea of bunkers anyway, as a modern warhead with the coordinates to a known site like Raven Rock could easily destroy the complex. If you ever find yourself in a gathering of UFO enthusiasts, you could certainly mention your interest in Area 51. But if you really want to make an impression, you should start asking about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Located in the rather unassuming city of Dayton, Ohio, Wright-Patterson has long been the subject of mystery and conspiracy theories, and some of those theories are actually linked to verifiable facts. As reported by the Dayton Daily News, Wright-Patterson was the host site for Project Blue Book, the government investigation intended to look into UFOs that officially ended in 1969. There's even a series of murals on base painted by German POWs that include Green Goblin-esque creatures, and some people have interpreted to mean that the Germans somehow witnessed little green men from outer space. Central to many theories is the possibly real, possibly mythical Hangar 18 somewhere on the base. Some of the bolder theories contend that Hangar 18 houses debris from extraterrestrial craft and maybe even the non-human pilots themselves, which may be linked to the 1947 crash in Roswell, New Mexico. However, the Air Force has repeatedly denied these claims, saying that there has never been a Hangar 18, though there is a Building 18 on base. Furthermore, nobody's come forth with definitive proof for any of these claims. While some people may think that they could potentially visit some of these facilities and at least survive their experience, some military facilities are off limits for very good reasons. It's one thing to lark about just outside the gates of Area 51, but it's something else entirely to visit another base and get a bad case of anthrax. Located in a remote section of Utah, Dugway Proving Ground is run by the U.S. military with the intent to test chemical and biological weapons. Understandably, then, access to the site is strictly controlled. In addition to the extensive laboratories on site, there are also training grounds, including a series of linked shipping containers that may have been modified to appear like cramped cave environments. Though little is known about the exact nature of testing at Dugway, there have been multiple incidents that have marked this facility's past. According to Smithsonian Magazine, around 6,000 sheep in the area were killed in March 1968. They were done in by a jet spraying nerve gas at too high an altitude. The gas dispersed beyond the grounds and coated grass that was later consumed by the sheep. More recently, a lab at Dugway inadvertently shipped live samples of anthrax across the country, which naturally enough raised considerable alarm. From endless disagreements between Allied forces to a military rehearsal that took a deadly turn, there are plenty of dark facts about D-Day that you were never aware of. The idea of invading France was first considered as early as 1942. The invasion is often portrayed as a triumph of careful planning and incredibly brave soldiers, and it certainly was both of those things. But that overlooks one key fact that also came close to being a horrifying disaster for the Allies. Americans sometimes think that because General Dwight D. Eisenhower was Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, that means America was in charge, but it was a partnership. As history notes, Eisenhower's staff was full of British officers, and the British themselves did much of the planning and logistics work. One of the reasons Eisenhower was chosen for his role was his ability to get combative personalities to work together, but he threatened to quit and throw the whole operation into disarray when the British pushed back on no-brainer plans to bomb the German lines prior to the landings. In fact, as NPR reports, Eisenhower was so painfully aware of how easily it could go wrong, he wrote out a statement to be issued if it went badly. And things did go wrong. Nearly everything, in fact. As Engines of Our Ingenuity notes, the bombs Eisenhower fought for mostly missed their targets. Naval bombardments were ineffective, amphibious tanks turned out to be not very amphibious at all, and the weather wasn't ideal, scattering Allied forces. The amazing thing about D-Day is that it succeeded at all. It was no big secret that the Allies were planning to invade France. As history notes, Hitler and his military advisors began planning for it as far back as 1942.
The Germans had been preparing for this invasion as long as the Americans and the British had been, and they had been digging in.
It was the obvious way to force the Nazis to spread their forces thin and ease the pressure on Russia in the east. In fact, Hitler ordered a huge string of fortifications to be built that same year, creating what came to be known as the Atlantic Wall, a network of bunkers, gun emplacements, and landing obstacles that covered 2,400 miles of the French coastline. So the Germans knew the Allies were coming, and they had the weapons, men, and fortifications in place to repel those forces. The chances of failure would have been pretty high, actually, except the Germans got one crucial aspect of their intelligence wrong: where the Allies planned to invade. Through a brilliant deception campaign, the Allies managed to convince Hitler and his high command that the invasion would hit at Calais, about 150 miles northeast of the actual invasion site. The Nazis couldn't be sure, but the possibility forced them to split their forces, a big reason D-Day succeeded. The brilliant part of all this is that Calais is actually the better choice for an invasion, which made it very believable. D-Day wasn't just a logistical nightmare, it was a literal nightmare. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, you have some small idea of what that first wave of invaders experienced. D-Day landings were brutal. In fact, they were probably worse than you can imagine.
Every inch of this beach has been three-sided! You stay here, you're dead now!
Estimates of exactly how many men died on those beaches vary pretty significantly, and it's impossible to know precisely how many died in the first wave. But it was a bloodbath. The Guardian notes that thousands of troops were killed by punishing machine gun fire as they stormed the shore. Some entire companies of soldiers were devastated, like A Company, 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry, which lost 60% of its men in 20 minutes. Men in supposedly amphibious tanks drowned, trapped inside when the tanks hit the water too soon and sank like metal coffins. The worst part was that this was accounted for. The generals planning the invasion knew incredibly high casualty rates were unavoidable. Author G.H. Bennett notes that it was estimated that 13% of all troops would drown before making it to shore, and the assumption was that 25% of Allied forces would die in a successful operation. And history reports that the Allies expected to lose 75% of the paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines just before the invasion. Ultimately, the true number of how many men died on that day will never be known. Considering what was at stake, you might imagine that the military leaders planning Operation Overlord and the Normandy invasion would want to be solidly in agreement before giving the order. The fact is, they argued over just about every detail right up until the end. History Extra notes that the British and the Americans went back and forth over the details for years. The British even delayed the invasion twice, opting to direct resources to an invasion of northern Africa and later an invasion of Sicily, Operation Torch and Operation Husky, respectively. There were good military reasons for these decisions, but the Americans suspected the British were trying to undermine the Normandy plan. As UVA Today explains, the British thought invading through Normandy would be too difficult and weren't afraid to express this opinion. In the end, the British only agreed because they worried the Americans would go their own way otherwise, but Prime Minister Winston Churchill continued to argue over every detail. History reports this bickering led to incredible chaos right before D-Day. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower actually threatened to resign when Churchill opposed having Allied bombers pulled out of Germany to bombard the defenses in France, which Eisenhower couldn't believe. The threat worked, and the bombers were moved. But it's kind of incredible to think that shortly before the largest amphibious invasion in history, the leadership team was in such a disarray. The Allied forces knew that any attempt to invade Europe by the Normandy beaches would meet stiff resistance. As Time notes, the German army spent more than 3 years and incredible resources building a series of impressive defenses called the Atlantic Wall. The series of bunkers and gun emplacements were just the outer edge of German defenses. They'd been in France for years at this point, and there were real concerns that armored divisions and reinforcements from France's interior would lead to an Allied defeat.
Beyond the formidable sea defenses, an army battle-hardened on the Eastern Front lies in wait.
As a result, a key part of D-Day involved dropping thousands of paratroopers behind enemy lines shortly before the attack. The 101st and 82nd U.S. Airborne Divisions were dropped on the Cherbourg Peninsula in order to secure areas, siege bridges, and other important transportation links, and sabotage the German defenses. It was a disaster. According to history, bad weather led to the paratroopers being dropped wildly off target, leaving them scattered and vulnerable to snipers and easy capture. Only 1/6 of the men actually reached their rally points. In the darkness and chaos, many paratroopers were forced to form ad hoc units on the run. Many drowned when they accidentally landed in flooded ditches or in rivers. The fact that paratroopers still managed to carry out their mission is nothing short of incredible. When we think of D-Day and the Normandy invasion, we think of guns and bullets, tanks and bombers. We think of the high number of casualties and the immense bravery required to step off those landing craft in the face of withering fire. But there was another aspect to the invasion that was just as crucial and just as effective: psychological warfare. As History Today notes, there was literally a psychological warfare division within the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. And the British Political Warfare Executive and the United States Office of Strategic Services collaborated on several psychological warfare operations. As noted by author David Welch, one of their main projects was Nachrichten für die Truppe, or News for the Troops. This was a newspaper designed to look like a legitimate news publication that mixed actual news and other stories with blatant propaganda designed to lower German morale. Close to 1 million copies were dropped in France just before the invasion. Smithsonian Magazine notes that the British also broadcast a regular radio program hosted by Gustav Siegfried Eins, who presented himself as a dedicated Nazi who was outraged at the behavior and failings of the Nazi hierarchy. As Coffee or Die notes, the psychological warfare was deemed a success because Nazi officers complained about their effect, and because so many German prisoners of war were found with the newspapers and other leaflets in their pockets. Mainstream history imbues D-Day and Operation Overlord with supreme importance when it comes to ending World War II. The usual narrative is that the Nazis were embedded in Europe, and the only way to end the war was to open up a second front. But as historian William Hitchcock notes, the Allies had been perfectly happy for years to let Russia absorb Nazi aggression on the Eastern Front, though they couldn't say so publicly. As the History News Network argues, the Germans were more or less doomed to lose the war ever since they failed to capture Moscow in the winter of 1941. Which transformed the war from an aggressive invasion to a slow war of attrition.
The Germans kept on fighting when we thought that they shouldn't do.
Put simply, in a grinding war of attrition, the math wasn't on the German side. The Nazis were already in retreat and doomed. In fact, just a few weeks after D-Day, the Soviets and their allies spearheaded an operation on the Eastern Front, Operation Bagration, which involved a staggering 2.3 million men, and saw forces strike the Nazis at the Belarusian front. So, if it wasn't crucial to ending the war, why put so much effort into D-Day? One reason was Allied worries that the Red Army would simply roll over Europe. In fact, this was the stated strategy of the Soviet Politburo in 1944. Operation Overlord was as much about stopping the Russian takeover of Europe as it was the defeat of the Nazis. The Allied forces knew the Normandy invasion was far from a sure thing. The Nazis built an impressive defensive line that stretched 2,400 miles of the French coastline, and they 100% knew the invasion was coming. If they guessed the location correctly, the chances of failure would be much higher. So the Allies created one of the greatest deception campaigns of all time. Operation Bodyguard involved placing the very real General George Patton in charge of a very fake army called the 1st U.S. Army Group, in order to convince the Germans that any invasion of Normandy would actually be a feint to draw Hitler's forces away from the real invasion, which would take place at Calais. Patton was chosen precisely because the Nazis knew him very well, and he was a believable choice to lead a major invasion of Europe. As Sky History TV reports, an entire fake army and navy was created in order to cloud Nazi intelligence and add credence to the Calais ruse. Inflatable tanks and fake boats were constructed, as were fake military installations that looked plausible in grainy spy photos. Entire teams were dedicated to generating convincing radio chatter for the Nazis to pick up. The ruse worked. Hitler hedged his bets, which softened the resistance at Normandy and even kept several army divisions near Calais for days after D-Day, still worried the invasion was just a trick. Operation Overlord and the Normandy invasions Americans refer to as D-Day took years and years of careful planning. So it isn't too surprising to learn that the Allied forces planned a dress rehearsal to test out equipment and training. What might be a little surprising is how disastrous that rehearsal ended up being. As BBC News explains, the operation was codenamed Exercise Tiger. On April 28, 1944, 8 ships designed to convey and land tanks on the beaches of Normandy were sailed with full cargoes to Slapton Sands near Devon, England, where the beach had been fortified similarly to Normandy. The Allies arranged to have live artillery fired near the ships to make the landings as realistic as possible. History reports that 23,000 troops were loaded onto the ships, which headed out to sea, then turned around and returned to stage the practice landing. But the radio chatter attracted German vessels, which launched an attack on the Allied forces. A British destroyer was supposed to have accompanied the ships, but had been ordered elsewhere at the last minute, leaving the tank ships undefended. 3 ships were hit by German torpedoes. When the sailors hit the water, they discovered to their horror that they were wearing their life jackets incorrectly, leading many to die of hypothermia in the frigid water. The disaster cost 800 lives, but the families of the army covered it all up to maintain security. War is ugly and violent, but over the decades, the narrative of D-Day has been established via movies and TV shows to be one of heroism and sacrifice. The soldiers landing on the beach that day are usually depicted as humble men drafted into one of the most important and dangerous invasions, reluctantly practicing violence. The Nazis naturally get a less positive spin. The truth is that there were war crimes on both sides: massacres, sexual assaults, torture, and worse. HistoryNet reports many incidents where Nazi soldiers outright murdered Canadian prisoners of war, including more than 150 who were killed while trying to surrender. After the war, the German officers involved in the incidents were identified, but only one, Kurt Meyer, was tried for war crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but only served 5 years. As the Washington Post notes, the Allies weren't immune from the atrocities. After the Normandy landings, many American troops were accused of sexual assault. General Omar Bradley warned the Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower about looting, pillaging, wanton destruction, rape, and other crimes being committed by Americans. Almost none of these crimes were reported or prosecuted. What happens when you send untrained and inexperienced American troops into a raging European war front, a battle that would catapult a formerly isolationist nation onto the world stage? The US of the early 20th century wasn't the US of today, and let's put things into perspective. It was still considered a fledgling nation that focused on isolationist policies. It was also balancing Industrial Revolution growth against a deep schism caused by the Civil War in the mid-19th century. With this in mind, it's little surprise that many of the European powers did not consider the United States' entrance into World War I a major game changer. In fact, the Library of Congress noted that the sum of the armed forces included just 127,000 Army soldiers, along with slightly more in the National Guard. As far as numbers, that put the US in league with smaller countries like Portugal in regard to strength. Though the United States may have started with a relatively small amount of troops, the numbers quickly grew thanks to widespread enthusiasm to enlist, as well as the draft. By the end of the war, the US had around 3 million troops, 2/3 of whom had been drafted. But larger numbers weren't as important as experience, and American soldiers were severely lacking in that department. Meanwhile, the European powers had already been at war for nearly 4 years. They were facing a stalemate in northeastern France when the US forces arrived under the leadership of Major General John J. Blackjack Pershing. Though there were minor skirmishes in the fall of 1917, most Americans received training throughout the cold winter, and their first action in the spring of 1918. On March 21st, German General Ludendorff launched an offensive that sought to break through the Allied lines. Among the troops sent to defend the line were the American Army's 1st Division, known as the Big Red One. It was the most well-trained division that Pershing had, and leadership was hoping that the men would be able to make their mark in the Americans' first real fight of the war.
It quickly established a reputation for hard fighting, and has become one of the most effective military units of the past 100 years.
The Allied generals decided that a united force of French and American troops was needed to capture the town of Cantigny from the Germans. The location was chosen because it was elevated and thus a relatively important observational post. Moreover, Cantigny was one of the recent victories that the Germans had won and which threatened the strength of the Allied lines. The stakes were high. Though Cantigny itself was not a vital strategic position, General Pershing knew that a victory was instrumental in showing American might and helping the morale of the French and British troops. Conversely, the Germans were determined to make the battle a stinging loss that would spread the impression that the American forces were useless and incompetent. In the days before the battle, things already seemed to be going poorly for the American newcomers. A lieutenant engineer carrying important documents, including maps, had been captured and killed by the Germans. Morale was also low after General Ludendorff launched an attack that set the grounds for an invasion of Paris. Even around Cantigny, the Germans raided the Americans just hours before the planned assault, meaning soldiers were already weary and tired. Despite the action throughout the night, the offensive on Cantigny continued as planned. The battle started early in the morning, around 6:30 a.m. on May 28, 1918. The man in command of the attack was General Charles P. Summerall. According to the 1st Division Museum, the assault began with the mass bombing of the German lines. Using the smoke as cover, French tanks began to make their way toward the small town. Using the tanks as a guide, American troops then charged forward with French aid. The details were meticulously planned. The tanks and troops would advance 110 yards every 2 minutes. This was deemed the best combination of speed with cover, and the premeditated ratio was masterfully successful. Within just half an hour, Americans were using flamethrowers to dislodge the Germans from their trenches to fully secure the small town. This process ended up being nearly as fast as the charge itself, and within the hour, the Americans had taken the town in what was a striking victory. However, the battle was far from over. The Germans were not ready to give up on Cantigny without a fight, and a counterattack seemed inevitable. The Germans were quick to try to retake the small town. and the first attempt to regain Cantigny started at 8:30 a.m. that same day. The morning counterstrike was easily repelled, but the counteroffensive began in truth that afternoon, with German bombardment of the Americans with heavy artillery. This was brutal for the U.S. forces, as they did not have the same firepower. The French artillery that was supposed to fight with the 1st Division had been sent to the Marne in response to General Ludendorff's surprise attack there. By the evening, the Allied position was considered extremely fragile. Nevertheless, the division held firm for a full 3 days. The American desire for a victory ended up being the grit needed to hold out against each new wave of bombardments. By May 31st, relief troops were able to make their way to the small French town, and the Germans were ready to admit defeat. But it was not without a price. The U.S. troops suffered 1,603 casualties.
The fields seen in the background are those over which the American 1st Division advanced in its attack on the German position.
The Battle of Cantigny proved to the rest of the world that the United States was no longer a sleepy backwater, but instead a major force to be reckoned with. Secondly, it also proved to Americans that they could hold their own against the Europeans, despite the fact that the continent's armies had more preparation and training than their U.S. counterparts. In fact, the Battle of Cantigny ended up being a major point of pride and was used to shore up public goodwill towards both the war and American military might with televised reels of the assault. U.S. competence ended up being instrumental in ending the First World War, with the German surrender on November 11, 1918.